It's to one microphone, is it?
No, we've all got them.
Oh, you've all got them.
Hey.
Feels like being on chairs be like the opposite of the point.
Hello. Hi. Welcome to this panel, 21st Century Far Right, New Faces, Same Targets, on the Edinburgh Radical Book Fair. Wonderful to see everyone out here this evening. Thank you all so much for coming. My name's Pavan, and I'm going to be chairing this wonderful panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by three exquisitely talented people who are going to be talking about the far right and how we might meet the challenge of the far right that has been posed to us. Let me introduce the three speakers. First, we have got Talat Yaqoob. Talat is a third sector leader, writer and campaigner focused on equality issues across politics, public life and the labour market. Most recently, she was part of forming Women Against the Far Right Scotland. We also have Panos Theodoropoulos is a sociologist in King's College London. He's organised with the Industrial Workers of the World and Interregnum, and he's the author of The Precarious Migrant Worker. We also have Anshuman Mondal. Anshu is Professor of Modern Literature at University of Anglia. He's the author of Racism and Free Speech. So we're going to kick off with a prompt or a provocation that I've given, or I'm going to give, to all our speakers to respond to. And then we'll have a bit of a chat amongst ourselves. And then we're going to throw it open to the audience, because I think we're all equally committed to having an open discussion with everyone who's here in the time that we have. And then at the end, we'll wrap up, hopefully, with a sense of renewed hope to get on with our days. So the question, the prompt that I have for all of you: what has caught your attention about the far right in the 21st century today? So let's start with you, Talat.
Sure. Evening, everybody. Really good to see everyone here, and thank you for the invitation from my favourite bookshop for the invitation to be here. So I think what's caught my attention, that's a really polite way of saying what's caught my rage, what's caught my frustration, what's caused me to tear my hair out, all of those things. I think what's caught my attention is the far right of today are better at using our tactics than what we are. That's what has caught my attention. So when it comes to grassroots mobilising, they're ahead of us. Narrative and storytelling, they're ahead of us. Resourcing, they have always been ahead of us. Right? When it comes to money and resourcing, they have always, decades, generations, they have been ahead of us. Access to traditional media and getting their narrative through political spaces and newspapers, etc., they've always been ahead of us. But actually, the storytelling, the connection of communities and building on the ground, actually they have taken lessons from what is left-wing activism and have implemented it with more rigour than what we, however, wherever on the left you see yourself, have used in recent years. And have caused division in a time when we should have been working towards solidarity and also participated in some of that division. So I think for me, they're better at our tactics, and that is part of my anger and frustration, for sure.
Panos.
Hello, everybody. So before I start talking about what has caught my attention, I want to direct your attention at an initiative that Lighthouse is involved with. A pretty beautiful and important initiative, which you can get leaflets at the till. But basically, Neil Davidson, this guy here, was a very, very important sociologist in Scotland. And he died a few years ago. He was a very, very committed activist, organizer, and social theorist. And the money that he left behind, he was a professor in the University of Glasgow, made possible the book for which I got invited here. They created the Neil Davidson Fellowship to allow precarious scholars to have time to write. So they basically gave us money for 6 months to write. And the next stage of that process, so literally I wouldn't be here without, paradoxically, without Neil's death. They're trying to continue doing really, really important work with what he left behind. So the next stage of the project is to raise £20,000 to create a library, because this man left behind more than 9,000 books and archival material. And the library will be open for anybody to access, scholars, organizers, etc. So you can get leaflets at the till. You can read about the project and also donate, and that would be massively appreciated. Sorry I think I spoke for like 2 minutes there. I have 3 to talk about the...
You're forgiven, my friend.
Cheers. I don't want to monopolize too much the conversation. I come from a perspective where, we were fighting against the far right in Greece for a long time. In contrast to the UK, in Greece, the far right actually was in government repeatedly, and anti-fascists were imprisoned, including, my grandfathers, etc. In 2011, my good friend Vasilis remembers that, in 2010, 2011, we were actively engaged with Golden Dawn, fighting them in the streets, and seeing a lot of differences in comparison to what we had seen in the books about, the historical far-right, fascism, Mussolini, etc. I think I'm just going to talk about one thing, and that is the fact that, I guess, traditionally, far-right narratives, obviously, the fascism and capitalism are synchronous, and, they love each other very much. But traditionally, there was this idea of the collective, which animated far-right rhetoric. This idea of the collective still exists when we talk about Britishness, etc., but it is a carcass. One of the qualitatively new elements of the far-right, and I'm taking my cue here from Alberto Toscano's book, Late Fascism, and also Bifo Berardi's book, Heroes. One of the qualitatively new characteristics is the fact that it is premised on intense competitive individualism. That is what underpins this shit. It's not anymore this idea that, the National Socialism, which really, had at least a semblance of anti-capitalist rhetoric. It was mobilizing people's anti-capitalism and diverting it towards capitalism still, but there was this kind of like desire for a form of collective resolution. Of course, it was an exclusionary collective, but it was still this. Whereas now we're dealing with intense competitive individualism, which is also to a very, very large extent infecting our movements and our ways of seeing ourselves. When you think about, the way that you manage yourself, you manage your body, you manage your time, social media, etc. So I think that the raw materials for fascism have been dispersed and are a lot more potent than potentially they were in the past.
For me, I would quite like to sort of just build on a couple of things that both Talat and Panos have said. I spent the last decade writing a book about free speech and how it's been weaponised by the right. And so one of the things I'd like to amplify from what Talat said is that they are incredibly sophisticated at appropriating the tools that they need in order to achieve what they want. I have a joke, a running joke with a colleague of mine. Both of us teach critical theory, not just Adorno and Foucault and Derrida and those people. That's a part of our professional life, and we keep. It's a very macabre joke between us, which is that everything we teach our students as a means of critically interrogating the capitalist reality is seen by the far right as a handbook and manual for maintaining that reality. And they are very good at that. And I hadn't realized until I started working on the free speech book just how sophisticated they are at doing this. What they've done is they've managed to appropriate the liberal ideas, and they've been aided and abetted by centre liberals who are more than happy to throw their lot behind the weaponisation of free speech. And the reason that has been so effective for them is that it is effectively, and it opens the door for them to provide an alibi for the rehabilitation of racist discourse, racist thought, and racist language on the streets. It's a joke when they say, when we go, people, in the past we used to go, oh, it's free speech in it, as a kind of satirical, ironical kind of gesture. Again, for them, it is deadly serious. The free speech opens a door for them in the way that it wouldn't. And what has been apparent is that the centre liberals have been quite happy to, as it were, entertain that idea in the name of free speech, because it doesn't cost them anything, right? The people it costs are the people who are the objects of that tactic. The people, racialised minorities, transgender people, and women, of course, because this is also opening the door for misogyny and extreme violence against women as well. The second thing I'd say is it's been a long time coming. When I started researching the book, I realised that movement started in the late 70s, this weaponisation of free speech. Of course, social media was the kind of, as it were, the rocket fuel that enabled it to really take off. But it was a deliberate tactic and strategy of US conservatives to use the First Amendment as a means of pushing back against some of the biggest kind of insights of the anti-racist movements of the 60s and the feminist movements of the 60s and 70s, which was the understanding that there is a dialectical relationship between the reality we live and the language you use to describe that reality. And they understood that if you could, as it were, enable the sluice gates of public discourse to be opened for racialized, misogynistic speech, you could start to change that reality too, with the alibi that you're just indulging in your free speech. The aim is simply to poison the well. Once the well is poisoned, social discourse, public discourse becomes degraded, and it's just a race to the bottom. And we're seeing that now. It took 40 years, but it's reached its political maturation with the willing and sometimes unwilling complicity of the liberal centre.
So I think in your book in particular, Anshu, what I found quite striking is the way you talk about liberal complacency. And I saw a link, a parallel, Panos, in the essay you recently published on Interregnum, right? And it talks about, it's titled The Limits of Organising. And what I found quite interesting in that essay was you entertain, or you think about this notion of kind of a liberal fantasy of converting the far right, right? There's in some sense a kind of almost religious proselytizing kind of register there that if only we could talk to them, they would know better. And you push back against that. And I'm interested to hear more about that. Could you say a little bit more?
So are people here familiar with the work of Jane McAlevey? Nodding heads? No? Nobody? A few people. So anyway, Jane McAlevey has written a lot about organising, and she gave us important resources, especially when it comes to labour organising, and the IWW uses it quite a lot. UCU is now organising an Organising for Power campaign, which is directly related to her work, whatever. So I was kind of like reading that book to use it, because I love that book. And it was this moment where Elon Musk had just thrown out the Sieg Heil, and we were all like, how the fuck? Because this thing is like an avalanche. You don't really understand it until it hits your house, right? So Alberto Toscano, in his book Late Fascism, talks about the seductive element of fascism. This idea that these people are not these people. Some of the people who are fascists, they have not been duped. The idea that exists not just in liberal circles, but also I am an anarchist. In anarchist circles, is that, you know, if we just organize enough, if we just hit the magic combination, you know, of community engagement, of care, of whatever, blah, 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 insert tactic here, magically people will become converted and convinced because these people are exploited, they are marginalized, they are disenfranchised, nobody listens to them, they are angry. We've all heard these arguments. Alberto Toscano talks about the seductive element of fascism, right? This idea of like violently puking your desire of authority over the other. Because you are exploited, because you are, you know, disenfranchised. Another good example, another good book is The Wages of Whiteness, obviously from, you know, taking the phrase of Du Bois, but, you know, this specific book talks about, anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But yeah, whiteness as a form of a wage, right? This privilege as a form of a wage. Anyway, to bring it back together, people are very, very invested in that. So I think that together with trying to organize, and of course we need to organize, otherwise I wouldn't be doing the things that I'm doing, we also need to prepare to defend ourselves. And that's the main point of the book, of the article.
So there are some limits to movement building in your argument. I'm going to come to you, Talat, because you've been involved with organizing against the far right as part of Women Against the Far Right. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and how's the last year been?
Well, Women Against the Far Right, and I'm part of Women Against the Far Right Scotland, there's Women Against the Far Right UK, and I'm part of a collection of phenomenal women, some of whom are brand new to me and are just exceptional women, who have brought this together, and they did the launch of it just last month. So what has been launched is new, but actually the activism, whether through trade unions, through student groups, through feminist groups, anti-racist groups, we've all been doing it anyway. But we've come together, and the reason we've come together is the weaponization of the so-called protection of women and girls. The weaponization of violence against women, but you only care when the perpetrator is a black or brown man. And you certainly don't care when the survivor of sexual violence is a black or brown woman, as we have seen repeatedly when we are seeing increasing incidences of racist hate crime and sexual violence going hand in hand. There's no rally, there's no protest against that, but there is for a palatable, fits your narrative spokesperson for your cause. And what's interesting is, a few months ago, there was a woman who had been groomed when she was younger, a white woman, and she was given a microphone at a far-right rally. And she started to talk about her experience, and she said, "I'm ashamed of all of you because you're only using me to be able to make your point." And they cut the mic off, made sure she got off the stage. Right? A very visual example of the fact that anything to do with women, when it's a deeply misogynistic movement, anything to do with women is only to be used as part of their puppeteering to advance their own issues, advance their own fascist agenda. But the work that we've been doing, and it's interesting, I don't disagree with what you've said about organising only takes you so far, but the work that we've been doing is trying to organise specifically women and marginalised communities to have the tools to organise and do the solidarity and building within their own spaces, because actually one of the consequences of what's happening right now is how isolated we feel and fearful we feel. And I can give you my own example. I'm a visible brown woman. I'm the daughter of immigrants, but I'm still privileged or somewhat safe because I don't wear a hijab. And because I have an acceptable accent, for example, right? But even I have experienced a different kind of tension just being in my everyday life. Yeah? Part of Women Against the Far Right is creating and building solidarity where we don't feel that kind of isolation and we get to come together, we get to build, we get to organise. But part of it is also bringing in women who are having their experiences exploited and are potentially being pulled into a misogynistic, racist, xenophobic system that is going to chew them up and spit them out when they're done with their stories. So it's also about opening the doors so that our organising brings in other people. But I do agree that there's this notion that if we just educated people enough, they'd be on our side. We love educating people, right? Let's do another awareness campaign. Jeez. Let's not, right? Let's campaign for systemic change. Let's campaign for the genuine redistribution of wealth. That's what's needed here. But that's also part of the campaigning work that we're doing, because if you can give hope, then you can bring more people in. If you can create systems change and you can get people on board with that, you bring more people in. And I think that is, for me, the hopeful element to all of this, is that we get to write the story, and we need to open the doors to, particularly, I think, people who are having their poverty, their experiences of sexual violence, co-opted and weaponised.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Mariam Kaba's injunction, right? That hope is a discipline, which I think we are compelled to invest in quite a bit in these times. The notion of weaponization, I think, is really interesting. You talked about how identity can be weaponized. And I'm going to come to you, Anshu, because I think that in a larger sense, you talk about how free speech has been weaponized. The notion of free speech has been weaponized. Often under the banner of educating people, as you've put it, Talat, educating people in the marketplace of ideas, right? And in the book, you're quite uncompromising about this. You say that liberals have basically functioned as useful idiots, right? To take Kasmuda's term, in this entire enterprise of free speech, right? And you propose the notion of fair speech, and I'm interested in that. Particularly, what does that mean for those of us on the left? How do we express or grapple with this notion of fair speech? And why do you think it's more useful a category as opposed to free speech?
Fair speech was the term used by my sub-editor for that, created by my sub-editor. But I actually think there is a little bit of value in it, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason why free speech has been so valuable to the right is this: it's become part of a political mythology, and that political mythology is that if you just set up sort of these neutral mechanisms, for this is a political mythology of the liberal centre. If you just set up these neutral mechanisms where every idea can be sort of bandied about and thought about and spoken about and so on and so forth, then the really valuable ideas will come out on top, and the ones that that have no value will be discarded, and so on and so forth. And that's what Mill does in On Liberty in 1859, and to a large extent, nothing is. The liberal thinking on that has never moved on. It's pretty much Mill, and that's it. And you think of any tradition where nothing moves on, that is an ossified tradition, but it's been ossified into this kind of cleaving towards this mythology of the free speech is the most important right, it's the most important value, and so on. But what it never says anything about is about the ways in which people are either empowered or disempowered to speak. You could say something which is world-shatteringly original and effective and creative, but if you do not have the platform, if you do not have the power to speak, that will not land. Nobody will hear it, and more importantly, no one will listen, because the protocols of actually listening are determined by power too. And that question of power is what's missing from the liberal free speech tradition, and it always has been, and it's always been a sleight of hand. It's always been a way of keeping certain people empowered and certain people disempowered. The reason I think that what I'm trying to do here is to say, let's reinsert power back into the scenario here. What would happen if we actually empowered people to speak who are from racialized minorities? If we actually empowered women, trans voices, in the way that we, in the way that we allow people like Elon Musk to overly saturate our bandwidth in terms of public discourse. What happens if you give those people the same kind of bandwidth as Elon Musk? You know, this is about equalization. It's about restructuring the terms on which debate is conducted, public discourse is conducted. Ultimately underlying that is this idea that actually we need to return to structural thinking. And that's one of the reasons that free speech has been so usefully weaponized by the far right, because it is a way of distracting us from the fact that society is structured unequally, including the ability to speak and to be listened to. If a society was, again, I return to dialectics, if society was structured more equally, the voices of those who've been disempowered would be amplified. The voices of those who are privileged would be muted. Their volume would be turned down. Underlying that is the necessity to restructure society. That is the restructure social relations, equalise them. So that's where that's the basic argument. Essentially.
Yeah. I think, Panos, you wanted to come in on that.
Connected with that, and I'm not going to talk for too much about this, is connected with that is the idea of freedom as such right now. So in the book, The Precarious Migrant Worker, I basically talk about how people internalize this compulsion to constantly perform. For example, you're in a job, you're in a kitchen porter or something like that, you get a burn, rather than seeing it as an element of, your oppression, you see it as a badge of honor. This is, I am a resilient worker, etc., etc. This is how capitalism gets people to buy into their own oppression. And I saw it in my research, for example, with women. It would be filtered through the lens of I am a strong and independent woman, therefore I can do this. With Polish people or Greek people, we are good workers, etc. But the key point, which is connected to what you were saying, is that this is all tied to an idea of autonomy and freedom. You are in objectively very, very, very oppressive, disempowered conditions, and capitalism gives you a way to mobilize your identity, whatever it is, to internalize and reproduce your oppression while thinking that you are free. And this is what happens also when it comes to fascism. We are basically dealing with diverging concepts of freedom in reality, but our analysis of what freedom is kind of the same, right? We both use the same words. The fascist talks about freedom. We talk about free speech. What is missing is power and structure. And what is this freedom means? So I think we, like, in terms of social movements, whoever is writing or, the way that you talk to your comrades, etc., like, I think that it's important to start dismantling this idea of freedom as, like, a good in and of itself. Yeah.
Towards the end of my book, I actually say that I've stopped using the word freedom. It's become an empty concept. It can mean anything and nothing. And I prefer to talk about empowerment now, because that's what we need. We need empowerment. We need people to be able to do things, to take power from those people who are withholding it from them. And that means that there must be a much more activist approach. We can't just let, in this case of discourse and public discourse, this idea that somehow the marketplace of ideas will make anti-racist ideas come out on top. It's not going to happen, because the entire marketplace is structured, it's rigged to enable it not to happen. So we have to take control, we have to empower ourselves, we have to empower our communities.
The neutrality bit is really fascinating. And before I come to you, Talat, I just wanted to also mention, so we were talking behind the curtain earlier, right? But one of these neutral mechanisms...
It's less exciting than it was. Like we were.
No, yeah, it really was.
Right?
It was quite a small room, I would say. But we had coffee, which was quite nice. Well, one of the neutral mechanisms that we were chatting about was the charity sector. And I love the term you used, the charity industrial complex, right? And you've got a lot of experience in this, right? You've engaged with it. So I just, when Anshu talked about the veneer of neutrality, I just wanted to add this in and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, I've got a lot of experience. I'm also still in it. So, and I'm a freelance consultant, so I also need to get paid. I'm going to be really careful about what it is I say next. But to talk about being locked into the wage war. But just briefly, on the topic of free speech, I'm just going to give a really vivid example of what the consequences of who has speech and what that influences, what that does. So I do a lot of media commentary. So unfortunately, you will sometimes hear me on the radio or TV or mouthing off in an opinion article. Other opinions are available, but they're wrong. But what I get trapped into is what Toni Morrison talks about in terms of racism being a distraction from being able to actually do the work that we want to do. The way in which the conversation is manipulated by not just the big names who have free speech, but those who don't have a platform but echo the same things as the big names with free speech. Recently, a Reform MP decided to talk about how she's sick of seeing so many black and brown faces in adverts because, it's not representative of the UK, and she sees too many of them, not understanding the fact that it's just the capitalism working the way it should because it wants the brown pound, right? But when I was asked to speak about this, and I'm really cautious about participating in these things, but when I was asked to speak about it, what I wanted to talk about was there was a time when an MP would get sacked for that. There was a time when at least they would get the whip taken off them for a week. There was consequence. Instead, this was galvanizing in today's politics, right? What I was asked about was, do you think white people aren't as represented as they should be on TV? Right? So the conversation has moved so far into the space of enabling the far right within a mainstream radio context because of what speech is given prominence and what speech is accepted. What I wanted to talk about was, actually, what does this say about the state of politics? What does this say about what we think of as important? Because quite frankly, as an anti-racist, I wasn't looking for a brown woman to sell me a Hoover during whatever it is I was watching. That wasn't my aim. Right? So this wasn't what matters. But what I got asked about was, does she have a point?
And you know what? That's one of the ways. It's a perfect example because that's one of the ways in which the terms of debate are structured.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that they lead to particular outcomes in terms of the conversation. So, nobody is censoring anybody in this scenario, right? But they are, because Talat's point is being precluded from being articulated. That is how free speech is being manipulated by the far right, and the liberal centre is just doing their work for them in just kind of reframing these questions so as to turn the conversation in a particular direction.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I don't get double-page news spreads to talk about how cancelled I am. If only. But in terms of your point about the charity industrial complex,
I only asked that because that's one of the venues that presents itself as neutral.
Absolutely. So this notion over years, charities, and I work with them, and they do phenomenal work, but they've been depoliticized. That's part of that's part of the process. That's part of where we are. Now, these are anti-poverty charities. Some of them are women's rights charities. Some of them would call themselves anti-racism or race equality charities. Some of them will talk about housing. There is not one thing I just said that isn't deeply, deeply political. But it's what is politics, and the politics of what we mean as party politics. And you can't talk about that because that's a bit dirty. So you just stick to the bit that you're meant to be doing, which is service delivery and mitigating state failure. Right? And there is no neutrality there. You're making a choice which is enabling state failure. Now, in a space where the far right is occupying so much space, and in a space where in 2026 we're going to see reform MSPs in double digits, I think the charity sector is going to have to make a choice about what it is mitigating or it refuses to engage in. And actually we have to make a step into repoliticization of what are political issues. And remember that the whole point of the charity sector was to do ourselves out of the need for our jobs because we were doing what the state should have been doing all along. So I think my goal is systems change work and reactivating the third sector into less of a sector and more of a movement?
I think that's fantastic.
Feel free to join in.
I think despite railing against the marketplace of ideas, it's time that we do open ourselves to the marketplace of ideas and democratize this conversation a little. I think so, yes. So let's do questions. I think it'd be fantastic to be able to discuss the various notions that have been brought up in a kind of open, collegial way. So I'm not sure what the mic situation. I think I'm going to be stripped of my mic. So, right. There you go.
Yeah. We're going to take questions. If you can keep your question as brief as possible so we can take a few, that would be great. Thank you. Just pop your hand up.
Thank you, guys. As a young person in Scotland, seeing the sort of monopolisation of the narrative that the far right is taking in sort of young spaces and online spaces, it's really scary. You know, that like Twitch, any sort of online platform, all of the sort of top people are far right. And I guess really my question is, as a young person, how can I engage my peers in political discourse and really get to have meaningful conversations with them to try and get them out of right-wing pipelines?
Am I supposed to invite whoever wishes to?
Panos, go for it. Because you're
Okay, let's start. Yeah, Talat, and then we'll work our way down.
First of all, I think that's an excellent question, and I don't think it's an easy context to be in. So, just good on you. That's the first thing. I think that needs to be acknowledged. And the second thing is, so when we think about the weaponisation of how far right gets to where it gets to, it's the weaponisation of poverty, the weaponisation of masculinity or fragility in that space. Now that and there's a real fine line between almost being apologising for it or giving it a rationale or an acceptability, but those tools are being used particularly around young men and boys. Yeah, there was a piece of work done by Laura Bates where you start off by asking, how to ask a girl out on social media in a Google search, and then it's how to build muscles, and within 2 days the algorithm has told you about how the consent doesn't matter, women's rights have gone too far, why white supremacy, they are channeled. And I think what actually needs to happen is more space for community, more space for conversation. And this is a little bit of where I think the neutrality within schools or high schools of this marketplace of ideas, but actually this is harmful and there needs to be some intervention, needs to be invested in, where those conversations can be open whilst also being free of disinformation. That takes training, that takes competency building, and that takes creating safe spaces for young people. That is something that should have been invested in when it was first talked about years ago, about what was happening in playgrounds, particularly around young women and girls, increases in sexual harassment in schools. There are blueprints on how to do this. It's whether the public sector and government want to invest in it, which of course they don't. So we need to find other avenues of investment so you can have those spaces where those conversations can actually take place. That would be my 2 cents.
I think that there's many ways. I mean, I can't give anybody a prescription on how to organize. I think that's part of learning, but also learning to be involved in social movements. But also, I think that obviously, if you are like in your 20s and I'm in my 30s, and I presume that some other people are older than that here, the fact that we are in this situation now is because we have fucked up. So I wouldn't take advice from us. Crime think. So CRIME. TH, crime, INC. So not think with a K, crime think with a C. They've got a lot of resources. They are an anarchist collective based in the United States, but they've got a lot of resources on organizing various ways. Organizing overtly, organizing covertly. So I would tell you to consult their work. And I also think that, masculinity is a huge issue, but I can't start talking about this now because it would be, we wouldn't finish. But I think that the most important thing that we have to do in general in terms of organizing is building social centers, social spaces, autonomous social spaces, ideally separate from the third sector, spaces that are controlled by a movement, that is independent, that doesn't rely on donors. If the third sector wants to help, by all means. But I think there needs to be spaces that are ours. And so if you have friends that are interested in this, I think that you can start by looking at how to create something like that in your community.
Anshu?
I'm 53. I'm one of these guys who's really, really quite old. I don't understand social media. I've never been on social media, excepting LinkedIn, which I've only just joined, and that's only because my arm was twisted by my university. So I can't give you an answer about the practicalities of that, but I can say that it seems to me that what Talat says is right, that the structuring of social media is such that actually the dice is loaded against sort of engagement on those platforms. That what Panos says is actually we have to try and direct those people, those young people, offline, into offline spaces again, and create human connections. I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean that we're seeing this resurgence of the far right within the kind of turbo capitalism that social media has kind of fueled, because the whole purpose of capitalism is to dehumanize. Marx said that right from the outset. The purpose of capital is to render us, strip us of our human potential, so that our only potential is in the service of capital. We have to try and claw back some space for our humanity, and I don't think that can happen online anymore. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about the online world to be definitive about that, but I just feel that we have to have human connections again offline if we're to try and build up some counter resources.
Just to say that it seems to me like a really profoundly difficult problem, because we're dealing with, as all of you have pointed out so articulately, what is hugely structural problem. But then friends and family are, by definition, interpersonal relations, individual relations. And what happens when you come up against a friend who says something or holds a certain belief that you find politically damaging is, I think, just very disturbing. I'm not sure what to do with that. I've encountered this problem. I think all of us would have encountered that issue. I'm not entirely sure. I have no idea what we do with it, but I do think it is on a deep individual level, it can be extremely disorienting, because what do you do with these people with whom you share kind of deposit of affect, positive affect, and then all of a sudden they say something, or you realize that they hold a certain view and you're not entirely sure what to do, right? But I think it's looking for an individual solution to a collective problem, and that's by definition one that cannot be reconciled. Did you want to add something, Panos?
Can I say something that I forgot to say at the beginning, but you reminded me of that with the interpersonal thing. So I live in London now. I used to live in Glasgow for like 6 years, but now I'm in London. So together with Xia Hung Pai, who is an investigative journalist who's done a lot of work with the far right, we actually went to the Tommy Robinson, to this massive protest, which had anywhere from like 500,000 to 1.5 to 70 million, if you believe them, But we actually went there, and we were talking to people, trying to understand, why are you here? Are you comfortable that, patriotic alternative is right next to you? All of these things. And there is a massive deficit of information. People believed just complete outrageous bullshit. But the interesting thing is that they didn't care when you corrected them. That's the most important thing. And I think that that's important because we're dealing with a situation where, maybe if you are very persuasive or if your friends are not complete assholes, you can kind of like wrest them back. Yes, that can happen. Yeah. There are, But I think that we need to be serious about the fact that some people have chosen sides and they don't care about the counter-argument. And therefore, that's why I'm talking about social centers, because we have to start thinking about institutions to protect ourselves while also building.
Shall we do questions in bunches of 3, given the mic situation, and then we can distribute?
Sorry, who was it?
Thank you so much for the great discussion. Opens up lots of fronts. I'm interested in the free speech question. In search for empty words, I'm also thinking about empowerment and the way, it can also be weaponized by the far right. So it's always dangerous, linguistic games, right? I want to ask the panelists how they navigate the two directions between participation, change the system from within, and abolition. The system is problematic altogether. We have to get rid of it altogether. Social media, since it was mentioned, is an interesting case because for approximately 15 years, we've thought that it offers empowerment. If I am a marginalized person in the Middle East and I, want to escape my physical environment, I can find people who are like-minded and connect with them. Well, guess what? Since Elon Musk was mentioned, now we've got the generative AI transformation of the free speech, of the empowerment into a product. So I've become increasingly more pessimistic as to the possibility of participation within the system and to change from within. And I at the same time, I find myself, okay, how do you abolish the system? Or how do you prove that, we're not elephants? Or maybe we should collaborate with other species as well to do something like that. That's my question. Yeah.
Are we going to take a couple more and then? Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. A really interesting discussion. As I understand, fascism based on the restoration of lost or threatened privileges, really. It's a movement for that. And I think we're seeing a kind of a decline in privileges that have previously been accrued to Western citizens in general, white people in particular, and white men in particular. It was referenced the wages of whiteness, this kind of idea of ideological compensation for wage slavery, which is, you granted membership of a sort of privileged elite race. Sylvia Federici talks about the kind of laws that reduced women's rights in the 1700s, reducing them more or less to married women to property of men as being a kind of form of compensation to men who'd lost their land in the enclosures by providing them a kind of domestic laborer and so on. And you've got all of this going on. Obviously, since the welfare state built on colonialism and neocolonialism also being eroded. So all of these sort of privileges are being eroded. And a basic fascist program in response to all of this seems to be converging around the purging of migrants, which and that's not exclusive to the far right. As you pointed out, the whole liberal centre, that's the whole political class is converging on this supposed solution. And I'm just wondering, I suppose my question is really, is mentioned about structure and so on, and I was wondering if you believe there's, and also Panos, you spoke about the kind of limits of, just trying to persuade people. You've referenced that a few times. And there is this idea sometimes on the left that it's just a matter of, people being misled and duped and so on. But is there actually in Western countries in particular, amongst Western white men in particular, is there a material basis for fascism, for this fascist program of purging migrants? I mean, the border regime is a means of ensuring privileged working conditions for a section of the global working class, isn't it? So is there a material basis for fascism, I suppose, is kind of what I'm asking in the West. Sorry for the long-winded question.
One more?
Right, thank you. I find the observation that the far right is using the tools of the left really, really interesting. And in particular, it seems like the far right has become this internationalist movement in a way that the left really hasn't materially achieved in a long time. In particular, I'm struck by, how Farage, draws from, the Trump agenda. And in particular, in the last few months, we've seen him trying to approach this almost like religious side of things, which to some extent seems to make more sense in the US, given that the UK and Scotland in particular is a much more secular country. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about this relationship between religion, traditional values, and the far right, and how we might see them interact with each other in the UK in the near future.
Yeah.
So we'll try to keep it brief, and then we should be able to do one more round of questions.
We'll be quick.
I'll just respond, if I can, to your question. Empowerment, everything can be weaponized. Anything can be weaponized, right? Ideas, concepts, language, these are all human things. It's what humans do with them that matters. You can do with them, do it one way, or you can do it another way, which means that you could weaponize anti-Semitism is a case in point. It is incredible. It is entirely valid to ensure that anti-Semitic discourse is not permitted. That would be absolutely in line with what I'm arguing about in racism and free speech. But that has been weaponized by people who want to silence pro-Palestinian voices. Anything can be weaponized. Empowerment, and this is the hope that I keep, is never individual. Your own individual empowerment is a sort of shadow empowerment, a kind of... it's only when it's collective, it's only when it's communal, communitarian, it's when it's shared, and when you're raising those boats together that empowerment is real. So yes, social media is not a space of empowerment, because social media is a space of disaggregation, is a fracturing of the collective. It gives you the impression of being part of a collective, but it's not. You are isolated in your room looking at your phone. And so, again, going back to what Panos was saying, we need to find those spaces where we can come together and collectivize together. Otherwise, our empowerment is just an illusion, really.
There was also a really interesting question on the internationalization of the far right, and I think I'll come to you, Talat, on the connections you see.
I'll be very quick on both points.
Yeah.
Right? You talked about participation in the system to try and change it and reform it, and on the outside in, burn it all. You've just described my weekly existential crisis. Okay, I'm really honest with you, because the kind of work I do, I find myself inside too often, going, how are we talking while Rome burns? What's happening here, right? And I find it really difficult. The answer is both at the same time, though. It's the inside and outside game, in my view. So actually, you need anarchy whilst other people are inside the room having those conversations, because where you are asking for 50%, it is those who are shouting against the system outside that allow you to get the 50% in the first place. Because if you don't do that, you will be reduced to 10% in the room, right? So actually, the inside and the outside game, and this is where we are failing, and the far right is working exceptionally well. We are not working together. The spectrum of the left, however you want to, the people who are within political party, people who are protesting in the streets, we don't have, well, quite frankly, we don't have enough anarchy in the UK, but The reality is those two spaces are not working together, which allows us to call for more and get more because the stakes have been made higher outside. Right? So actually both things need to be happening at the same time. That is competent political strategy. The internationalist point. Fascism and religious, extremist Christian idealism, in fact, any extremist religious ideation go hand in hand with each other. Farage is coming after abortion rights across the UK. That's absolutely happening. He is being funded and he is, has been lobbied by American anti-abortion experts and campaigners. The point is that preventing women, all women, from having their rights and going down a line of misogyny is a great access point for full-blown fascism. And actually, women are on the front line of that all of the time. If you see examples, whether it's in Turkey, whether it is in Hungary, whether it's in actually stripping women of their rights to try and create a homogenized society, to have traditionalist appeals, and misogyny is an excellent gateway into fascism. That's what's happening, and that's the connection between Trump and others and Farage. And we need to be fighting and protecting and advancing reproductive rights in the UK right now.
There was also the question, I think, specifically to Panos, especially at Panos, the question on fascism and the demonization of migrants. Is there a material basis for this, do you think?
I mean, we don't have...
I feel like you could give an entire lecture on this, so you'll have to restrain yourself.
Just so we can get another quick round of questions in, yes, but so in the book, The Precarious Migrant Worker, I show that, there is a lot of, there is a material basis for, all of these, the prejudices, hate, whatever you want to call it. But I also, I don't show it. My participants showed it to me and the ethnography showed it, that there is still, even though all of these things have become individualized and they lead to, feelings of lost privilege, etc., what is still uniform is an acute awareness of class injustice. So even people who might, be mobilizing these narratives of masculinity, toxic masculinity, and then it goes into the far right, etc., it spills out. There is what is omnipresent is this idea that we're fucked, and we're fucked because of the rich, but the way that you respond to that changes. And the reason that this disaffection and this acute awareness of class-based injustice is not led to some other direction, to the degree that it is possible, because, as I said, some people will have to fight, is precisely because we are not present in these communities to a very, very large extent, which is why I go back to social centres, because precisely it is a materially based, I guess, solution or approach.
Excellent. I've got an eye on the time, and I would like to end punctually because people might have places to go. However, everyone's going to be hanging around. The authors will be around to sign their books, should you choose to purchase a copy. But we're also very happy to chat informally after the end of the event. So, firstly, big thank you to Talat, Panos, and Anshu for wonderful discussion. And thank you also very much for coming and spending this time with us. It's been absolutely wonderful. I think we'll hang out right there at the back with the books. So come and chat.
And thank you for cheering.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Excellent.
Yeah, the signing will be at the back. And just to mention, there will be a special on Pavan's book, Straight Nation, today. And you can find that at the back as well. Thank you.